The jungle planet of Vera 4 was alive with sounds that never stopped. A constant hum of insect wings mixed with the calls of unseen creatures hidden in the dense canopy above, while the ground itself seemed to breathe under the weight of roots, twisting and pushing through the dark soil, reminding anyone who stepped here that survival was never guaranteed. Mark, the human explorer assigned to this survey mission, had spent the better part of his life traveling from one frontier world to the next, learning to adapt in places where even the air seemed like it wanted to fight him. He was used to strange stares, the cautious glances from alien companions who rarely thought much of humans, and though the pattern repeated itself on Vera 4, this time it felt sharper, more personal, because of the girl who made no attempt to hide her disdain. Sira, the alien warrior, carried herself with the posture of someone born into strength, her tall frame casting shadows over most of the crew, her dark eyes sharp like blades, and her every movement a reminder that she belonged to a species that had thrived in battle for centuries. To her, Mark was fragile, soft-skinned, too calm in a place that demanded constant alertness. She spoke little to him, and when she did, her words were clipped as if wasting time on him was an insult to her patience. Their first meeting had been simple enough. He introduced himself with a casual nod, voice steady, as though arriving on a world filled with predators was just another stop on his long journey. But Sira's response had been nothing more than a brief glance before she turned her focus back to sharpening the blade she carried on her hip. The rest of the crew noticed the chill between them, though no one addressed it directly, leaving the tension to hang in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Mark didn't push her for conversation, but he could feel the weight of her judgment with every step they took through the undergrowth. When he adjusted his scanner, she would look at him as though expecting him to fail. When he made an observation about animal tracks, her silence was louder than words, as though saying, "Your ideas don't matter here." The planet itself gave no room for weakness. Vines as thick as a man's arm hung across their path, some coated in sharp thorns that tore at clothing if brushed too carelessly, while the ground held hidden sinkholes that swallowed unwary travelers whole. The survey team had strict routes to follow, but even then there was never a guarantee of safety. Mark noticed how Sira walked with a confidence born from training, her eyes always moving, scanning the tree line. But he also noticed that her caution was fueled not by fear but by a deep respect for the dangers around them. He admired that about her, even though she saw nothing admirable in him. During one evening when the team set up camp near a shallow stream, Mark sat quietly, listening to the chorus of night calls as he repaired one of the drones used for recording wildlife movements. Sira sat nearby, her posture rigid, polishing the strange armor pieces she wore, and though she did not speak to him, her silence seemed filled with unspoken words. Finally she said, without looking at him, "Your kind does not belong here. The jungle will consume you." Her voice was steady, certain, the tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering an opinion. Mark didn't rise to defend himself. Instead, he glanced at the jungle and replied in a calm, even tone, "The jungle consumes everyone if they don't learn to respect it. Human or alien, it doesn't care." That answer caught her off guard for just a moment, though she quickly masked it by returning to her armor, dismissing him as if his words carried no weight. But Mark had spent enough time around others like her to know that trust was not given easily. Humans were often judged as fragile because of their appearance, their lack of claws or armored skin. Yet Mark understood that his people's strength was not in the sharpness of their bodies, but in their ability to endure, to adapt, to keep standing where others fell. He wasn't here to prove himself to her, but he knew that sooner or later, the jungle would create situations where his actions would speak louder than any words could. As the days passed, the team pushed deeper into uncharted territory, mapping out regions where the ground shook faintly at night and trees bore scars of enormous claws dragging along their trunks. Every sign pointed to creatures larger than anything Mark had faced before, and while most of the crew respected his cautious approach, Sira openly dismissed his observations. "You see shadows where there are none," she said one afternoon, after he warned them to take a different path due to disturbed soil. But when one of the younger scouts tested the original path and nearly fell into a hidden pit, lined with spines grown from the earth itself, even she had to pause. though her pride kept her from admitting he had been right. The tension between them wasn't just about distrust, it was about two different ways of surviving clashing against each other. Sira's people believed in strength, in meeting danger head-on, proving themselves by standing unshaken. Humans like Mark believed in balance, in watching, learning, and acting only when the moment was right. To her, his caution was weakness. To him, her boldness was recklessness. Yet beneath that clash was something neither of them admitted aloud, an unspoken curiosity. She wanted to understand why he carried himself with such calm despite her disdain, and he wanted to know what kind of strength lay beneath her cold exterior. Late one night, as rain poured heavily against the canopy, Mark worked under the dim glow of a portable lamp, fixing a damaged scanner while the others rested. Sira was awake too, her back against a tree, her weapon across her knees, keeping watch. For the first time, their eyes met without hostility. She studied him quietly, as though trying to figure out what drove him to keep working despite exhaustion. "Why do you not fear this place?" she asked at last, her voice low, almost curious. Mark didn't look up from his work as he answered, "Because fear doesn't help me survive. Respect does." She said nothing after that, but for the first time her silence wasn't dismissive, it was thoughtful. The jungle planet offered no comfort, only challenges, and as the team prepared to move toward the predators' hunting grounds, the air between Mark and Sira remained tense, but now it carried something new as well. A faint shift, a sense that perhaps their story was just beginning. She still distrusted him, still thought of him as fragile, but in the back of her mind, the calm human had planted a small seed of doubt in her certainty, and in a place where survival meant everything, doubt could grow into something far greater. The following day dawned heavy with mist, the jungle breathing a pale white haze that curled between the trees like restless ghosts, and every member of the survey team could feel the weight of crossing into a region spoken of only in fragments, of old reports, half-erased warnings buried in the expedition logs of those who had come before and never returned. It was called the Predator's Territory, not by accident, but because every track, every mark on the trees, and every silence that hung over the canopy seemed to whisper of something that ruled these lands without challenge. Mark adjusted his pack straps as they moved, scanning with a handheld sensor that kept flashing with irregular signals, bursts of heat too large to belong to ordinary wildlife, yet always vanishing before the machine could capture them properly, while Sira moved ahead with her spear-like weapon at the ready, her posture alert, her eyes narrowing at every rustle in the undergrowth as though daring something to reveal itself. The rest of the team kept their voices low, nervous energy spreading like a quiet fever, and though no one said it out loud, the unspoken truth was that even the bravest among them felt like prey here. Mark's calm expression did not falter, though his mind was working constantly, piecing together every fragment of evidence he could gather, noting claw patterns on bark too high for any normal beast, analyzing the way the sounds of smaller creatures cut off entirely whenever they advanced into certain stretches of forest, and he realized with growing certainty that they were not simply passing through a dangerous region. They were walking deeper into the domain of an apex predator, intelligent enough to watch them from the shadows. At one point they came upon a clearing littered with bones, some stripped clean, others crushed as though by immense jaws, and the air there smelled of iron and decay. Sira crouched to examine the remains and muttered in her own language before, translating flatly. "This one was killed recently. The creature hunts close." Several scouts stiffened, one reaching instinctively for his weapon, but Mark held up a hand, his voice quiet but firm as he said, "Weapons won't help if we don't understand what we're facing." Sira shot him a sharp look, annoyance, flashing in her eyes as if he had questioned the very foundation of her warrior upbringing. Yet she could not deny the logic in his tone. They pressed on, the jungle growing denser until even the light of day seemed strangled by vines and towering trunks. And in that dimness, Mark felt the shift most keenly, the atmosphere heavy with the presence of something vast, unseen, circling, with patience. The first true test came when a young scout strayed too far to collect samples and the undergrowth exploded in a blur of motion, a shape too large to comprehend in a single glance, scales glistening dark against the filtered light, eyes burning with primal fire. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged, jaws snapping down where the scout had stood a heartbeat earlier, and only Mark's shout and quick shove had pulled the youth away in time. The predator did not press its attack, not yet. It lingered, at the edge of sight, its massive form weaving between trees as though testing them, as though enjoying the hunt. The team clustered, weapons raised, and Sierra took her place at the front, blade gleaming as she barked an order in her native tongue to hold the line. But Mark studied the movement differently. He saw how it did not strike immediately, how it circled, how it seemed to be measuring them, and a chilling thought came to him that this was not a simple beast but a hunter with strategy, patience, and perhaps even curiosity. Hours dragged as they pressed deeper, each step weighed by the knowledge that the predator followed, unseen yet never far, until the group set camp in a narrow ravine where cliffs rose on either side like prison walls. The others slept in shifts, but Mark stayed awake, watching the tree line until he saw it again. Two eyes glowing faintly in the dark, unblinking, watching. Sierra joined him, her weapon at the ready, and whispered, "You still do not fear." Her words were not mocking, this time but edged with something closer to wonder. Mark kept his voice low, his eyes on the glowing stare, and answered, "Fear won't make it leave us alone, but respect might." They sat in silence for a long time, predator and prey studying one another, until finally the eyes vanished back, into the black, leaving behind the uneasy certainty that this was no random encounter but the beginning of something deliberate. In the morning, they would have to decide whether to turn back or push further into its domain. And while the others argued in hushed voices about survival, Mark knew with quiet clarity that this predator was testing boundaries, and sooner, or later, it would choose whether they were intruders to be destroyed, or something else entirely. The morning broke with a strange silence that wrapped the jungle like a cloak, and though the team had survived the night without another direct attack, unease clung to them heavier than the mist that rolled across the ground, for every instinct whispered that the predator had not retreated, but had only drawn back to observe, to weigh them with the same patience it had shown before. And it was this thought that gnawed at Mark most of all as they prepared to continue, deeper into the ravine's exit path. The cliffs narrowed, the ground soft and damp beneath their boots, and every footfall seemed loud in the emptiness, as though the jungle itself were holding its breath. Sierra walked ahead, shoulders taut, scanning constantly with the sharpened focus of someone who knew this was no ordinary creature, but a ruler of its world. And though she still doubted humans, she found herself glancing back at Mark more than once, unsettled by the calm resolve on his face. It was not the bravado of arrogance nor the foolish stillness of ignorance, but something steadier, as if he were quietly preparing for a trial he already knew was coming. The path soon opened into a basin carved by time and water, with sheer walls and towering trees rooted in the stone, their twisted branches forming a roof that let only shards of sunlight fall like broken glass onto the moss-covered floor. It was here, in this natural amphitheater, that the predator revealed its hand. A sudden roar shattered the air, rolling through the basin like thunder, and before the team could form a defense, smaller shapes burst from the undergrowth, scaled, beasts half the predator's size, their jaws lined with dagger teeth, their movements too fast for ordinary soldiers to track. Panic struck the group, shouts echoing as weapons fired and blades clashed, but it quickly became clear that these were not random creatures. They moved with coordination, driving the team into tighter formation, separating them into clusters, like sheep herded by wolves. Mark recognized it at once. This was no wild attack but a test, orchestrated by the larger predator that now watched from the ridge above, its massive frame silhouetted against the fractured sunlight, unblinking. As it studied how its prey fought, blaster fire lit the air, the creatures shrieking as a few fell, yet more came, leaping with snapping jaws, and one nearly tore into a young surveyor before Mark hurled himself forward, slamming a makeshift tool-turned weapon into its flank, forcing it back long enough for the scout to scramble free. Sierra's blade gleamed as she cut down another, her movements precise and feral, yet even she realized something troubling. The creatures were not striking to kill quickly, but to exhaust, to corner, to see how long the team could last. Hours seemed to blur as the battle dragged on, sweat and blood mixing with the damp air, until finally the smaller beasts withdrew, vanishing into the foliage as suddenly as they had come, leaving the basin littered with marks of struggle, panting, survivors and the heavy weight of the predator's gaze from above. No one dared speak at first, the silence crushing, until Mark finally raised his head toward the ridge and spoke clearly, though his voice was low, steady enough to carry across the hollow. "You wanted to see how we endure. You have your answer." His words were not shouted, not desperate, but spoken with a strange conviction that startled the others, and even Syrah turned to him with widened eyes, realizing that he was not addressing the team, but the predator itself, acknowledging it not as a beast but as a thinking rival. The massive creature tilted its head slightly, its scaled crown catching a streak of light, and for one breathless moment, no one moved, as if the entire jungle leaned in to hear what choice it would make. Then, with a sound like boulders grinding, together the predator turned and slipped back into the trees, silent as shadow, leaving only the certainty that this was far from over. The team gathered their strength, shaken but alive, and arguments erupted almost immediately, some insisting they retreat, others claiming they had to press on for the mission's sake. But Mark said little, only studied the claw marks left, in the earth where the predator had stood, his mind racing with the idea that this creature was not simply testing their strength, but measuring something deeper, something he suspected Syrah's people had never considered. When she finally approached him, her voice lower than usual, she asked, "Why speak to it as though it understood?" He met her gaze, his eyes calm, yet burning with quiet certainty, and answered, "Because it does. And if we ignore that, none of us will leave this place alive." The following day dawned with an uneasy stillness, the jungle unusually quiet, as though every living creature had vanished into hiding, and the team felt that silence weigh on their nerves, for they knew the great predator had not abandoned them, but was instead waiting, watching from the shadows beyond sight, shaping its own judgment in ways they could not predict. And it was in this quiet that Mark found himself thinking more deeply about the strange intelligence behind its actions, a thought that unsettled Syrah even more than the battle itself. She had grown up hearing that humans were fragile, clever perhaps, but ultimately untested. Yet here was Mark speaking of the predator not as a beast, but as a rival with will and purpose. And though she wanted to dismiss his words, the memory of its patient gaze on the ridge refused to leave her mind. The team pressed forward into new territory, guided by the mission to map the planet's resource lines. Yet every step felt heavier, as if they were trespassers on sacred ground. And soon they entered a canyon filled with mist, the walls slick, with vines and hidden crevices, where the air carried the scent of damp earth and something older, a warning that predators often left behind. As they advanced, movement stirred in the fog, shapes shifting in and out of view, and at first the soldiers tightened formation, weapons raised, but Mark held up his hand and urged them to wait, his instincts pulling at him that this was not another direct attack but something different, a trial of another kind. From the mist emerged not the hulking predator itself, but smaller figures. Its young, 3 of them, each the size of a large wolf, their scales shimmering faintly as they padded forward with curious eyes and low rumbling growls, circling the team not with hostility but with the kind of cautious curiosity that mirrored the watchfulness of their parent. Syrah stiffened, her hand on her blade, but Mark spoke quickly, urging the group not to fire, and though his voice was calm, every muscle in his body was alert, knowing that any wrong move could summon the adult from hiding in a storm of fury. The young predators moved closer, sniffing the air, testing the humans with deliberate steps, and when one of the soldiers flinched and aimed his weapon, a sudden roar split the sky, so powerful that the mist itself seemed to scatter. And there, on the canyon rim, stood the great predator, its massive form outlined against the pale morning light, its golden eyes burning with warning. The soldier froze, trembling, and Mark quickly lowered the weapon by force, whispering urgently that they had been given a test, not a death sentence, and if they failed it, the outcome would be swift and merciless. Slowly, carefully, Mark knelt to the ground, lowering himself until he was at the level of the young predators. And though every instinct screamed at him that he was one heartbeat away from being torn apart, he held himself steady, meeting the curious eyes of the nearest. Young with quiet patience, offering no aggression, no fear. The others watched in tense silence, unable to believe what they were seeing. And even Sira's breath caught as the young predator stepped closer, its scaled snout brushing against Mark's outstretched hand, a gesture of inspection rather than attack. For a heartbeat, the canyon seemed to hold its breath, and then the great predator above rumbled low, a sound not of anger but of acknowledgement, as if it had seen what it needed. The young predator pulled back, giving a guttural chirp before returning to its siblings, and together they retreated into the mist, their heavy steps fading into silence, while the great predator lingered one moment longer, its gaze fixed on Mark, before vanishing back into the trees. The team was left trembling, disbelief etched on their faces, but none more so than Sira, who stared at Mark with a new intensity, as though seeing him for the first time, not as fragile or foolish, but as someone who had crossed a line of understanding her people had never dared approach. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both confusion and a reluctant trace of respect, asking, "Why you? Why would it allow you near what it protects most?" Mark did not answer at once, his eyes still fixed on the ridge where the predator had vanished, but when he did, his words were simple, almost quiet. "Because it knows I see it as more than a beast." His answer left a silence heavier than any roar, for it planted in her mind the possibility that humans carried something even her proud warrior species had overlooked. A way of earning trust, not through strength of arms but through patience, understanding, and the courage to face fear without letting it rule them. The jungle seemed different after the encounter in the canyon, not because it had grown less dangerous, but because the balance had shifted, and for the first time the team felt that they were not simply intruders but subjects under silent judgment, every step weighed by an intelligence older and more calculating than they had guessed. And though the others whispered nervously about what had just happened, Sira kept her gaze locked on Mark, unsettled by how calmly he carried himself, as though kneeling before the predator's young had been the most natural thing in the world. That calm unnerved her more than the beast itself, because she had built her identity on the belief that strength was measured by blade and roar, by how much fear you could command. Yet Mark had faced the same terror with patience and quiet eyes, and the predator had answered him not with teeth, but with something close to recognition. Their mission pressed on, deeper into the jungle where cliffs rose like black teeth and rivers cut through the earth in boiling torrents, and the further they went, the more it seemed the predator's shadow followed them, sometimes through the eerie silence of birds gone quiet, sometimes through the distant crack of branches that fell without wind, as if reminding them that every choice was being observed. That night, while the campfires flickered weakly in the damp air, Sira took a place across from Mark, her thoughts heavy with questions she did not know how to ask, until finally the words left her sharper than she intended, accusing him of recklessness, of endangering everyone by kneeling before the predator's young instead of driving them off as any sane warrior would. Mark met her glare steadily, answering not with defensiveness, but with a question that caught her off guard. Would driving them off have proven strength? Or would it have proven we are too afraid to stand still? The simplicity of it stung more than a blade, and she turned away, but the seed of his meaning rooted itself inside her. The test of their strange bond came sooner than expected, for the following day, while charting a valley of towering ferns, the team stumbled into the hunting ground of another predator. This one not the golden-eyed beast but a rival, leaner and savage, with serrated spines along its back and a shriek that rattled stone. It struck fast, scattering the soldiers, and in the chaos Sira found herself pinned against a rock wall, the creature's jaws snapping inches from her face, its breath hot and rancid as she fought to hold her blade between its teeth. She braced for the inevitable, knowing her strength was failing when suddenly the shriek was drowned by another sound, Mark's voice, shouting, not in panic but with an odd steadiness that cut through the chaos, calling her name as he hurled a flare into the air, its red light exploding against the canopy. The rival predator turned toward him, distracted by the burst, and in that heartbeat Sira drove her blade upward into its throat, forcing it back in a spray of sparks from its clashing spines. The creature staggered, snarled, and then collapsed, its body twitching before falling still, leaving the team shaken but alive. Yet the victory was short-lived, for from the ridge above came a low rumble, deeper and far more commanding. And there stood the golden-eyed predator, its form massive, against the fading light, watching them in absolute silence. The soldiers froze, expecting death, for they had slain one of its kind, rival or not, and Sira herself tensed, ready to stand between Mark and the beast, when to her astonishment it descended the ridge slowly, not with rage but with deliberate purpose. It approached the fallen rival, sniffed at the corpse, then turned its gaze toward Mark, its eyes flickering in the glow of the dying flare, and Sira realized with a shock that this was not anger, but another judgment. The great predator lowered its head, almost brushing the ground near Mark, and then let out a sound that was not a roar, but a deep, vibrating growl that resonated in their bones, before stepping away and vanishing into the jungle once more, leaving behind only the weight of what had just passed. Silence fell over the team, broken only by the crackle of fire and the rush of the river. But inside Sira something had shifted again, for in that moment she understood that the predator had not come to punish them, but to see whether Mark's choices extended beyond kneeling in peace, whether he would risk himself for others even in chaos. Later, as the camp settled, she approached him once more, her voice quieter this time, no longer laced with accusation, but with something closer, to wonder, and she asked him why he would call out and risk drawing the rival's fury when he could have hidden. His answer was simple, spoken while staring into the flames. Because if we only live for ourselves, we're not worth trusting. For the first time, she found no argument on her tongue, only the uneasy realization that the human she had, dismissed as fragile, had been teaching her, not through boasting, not through force, but through the way he chose to act when fear clawed at the edges. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the canopy above, knowing that her people would laugh at the thought of learning from a human. Yet the truth lingered in her heart, that trust was no longer a possibility to resist, but something already growing between them, shaped not by power but by the courage to face fear without letting it rule. The days that followed carried a heavy silence over the survey team, for though they had survived the attack and witnessed the golden-eyed predator's strange acceptance of Mark, no one dared to speak too loudly about it, as if naming it might shatter the fragile thread of safety that held them. Supplies were running low, storms brewed on the horizon, and every shadow in the jungle seemed to hold more weight, pressing down on nerves that were already fraying, until one evening the breaking point arrived in the form of an accident that no one saw coming. The team had been mapping a river crossing, its current fast and thick with debris from the storm the night before, when one of the soldiers slipped on the wet rocks and fell into the rushing water. The current caught him instantly, dragging him downstream toward a jagged gorge, and though several tried to throw ropes, none were quick enough. Without hesitation, Mark sprinted after him, diving into the torrent with a force that stunned the others, his body tossed like driftwood as he fought to reach the drowning man. Sira, watching from the bank, felt a panic she had never known before, not just for the soldier but for the human she had sworn to distrust, for this river was known among her people as the Bone Churner, a place where even their strongest warriors never returned. The team scrambled along the edge, shouting directions, but Mark ignored them all, focusing only on the flailing soldier ahead. His arms strained, legs kicking against the drag of the current, until finally he caught the man's arm, locking him in a grip that looked as if it might tear them both apart. The gorge loomed closer, water crashing down into a foaming pit that promised nothing but death. Yet Mark did not release his hold. Instead, he angled them toward a cluster of jagged rocks where the current split, using the last of his strength to slam the soldier toward safety while the force of the water pulled him under. Gasps erupted from the team as Mark vanished, his body swallowed by the roar, and Sira's heart pounded with a fear that startled her, fear not of the river, not of the predators, but of losing him. She leapt into action before she could think, sprinting downstream along the treacherous cliffs, eyes scanning the waves for any sign of him, until she spotted his form thrown against a fallen tree lodged in the water. She didn't hesitate, diving in with a warrior's scream, her powerful limbs cutting through the current as she reached him, his body limp but still breathing. With a strength born of desperation, she dragged him back toward the shore, both of them battered by rocks, her arms aching as she refused to let go until finally they collapsed together on the mud, coughing and gasping while the others rushed to their side. Mark lay there shivering and pale yet alive, and the soldier he had saved stumbled toward him, eyes wide with a gratitude too deep for words. The team cheered faintly, their voices breaking with relief, but Sierra did not join them. She knelt beside Mark, watching his chest rise and fall, realizing with a clarity that cut through her pride that this human's will was stronger than anything she had ever known, because he had given everything, even to the point of death, for someone who was not his kin. Later, when he had been wrapped in blankets and the fire burned high against the cold, Sierra sat close to him, her mind restless with questions she had never dared to face. She asked him why he had risked himself again, when the soldier's life could have been written off as fate, and Mark, his voice weak but steady, answered that life only mattered when it was shared, that no one deserved to be abandoned if there was still a chance. Those words pierced her more deeply than any blade, for in her culture strength was shown by victory, by survival, by standing above others. But here was a man who measured strength by what he was willing to lose. That night, as the storm howled around them and the jungle seemed to whisper with unseen eyes, Sierra sat awake, keeping watch not for predators but for Mark, and in her heart she admitted what she had resisted since the first day, that trust was no longer a fragile thread between them but a bond forged in water, fire, and the edge of death. The breaking point had come, not in their failure but in the proof that even in the face of nature's fury, the human had chosen not himself but others, and in that choice he had shattered every doubt she had carried. Yet deep within, as she watched him sleep, she felt something else too, a weight she could not shake. That the predator with golden eyes was still watching, waiting for the final measure of what this bond meant, and the true test had not yet come.